Good evening, the Awoken, and welcome back for another episode of Awoken with Aulden. I'm your host, as always, Aulden S. Nance, and we have a beautiful topic, important topic, a promised topic that I have hinted at you for the past couple of weeks. I've mentioned my background and campaigns several times on the show before, and it's now we're heading into the major events of the primary season for the 2026 midterms. Very excited to show some previews with you. You got a at Zemo's Sports hi in all capital letters. Hello, Zemo. Good evening. Glad you're on the stream this evening. Welcome back. Saw that you were on the stream at the ICE protest earlier today. So thank you very much for being here once again. Okay, so just a little recap of what we've done the last day and a half. If you were here last night, might have been one of the more fun streams of the entire channel's history. Okay, I actually just tried to call you, didn't know you were doing a show, and you're welcome. Awesome. I'll have to check my phone here and after the show, something like that. But just a little recap. So if you were here last night with us, we did a live stream for President Trump's State of the Union address. I believe it's the longest. He set the record for the longest address for a U.S. president. He highlighted accomplishments and what he's hoping to sell for the economy, foreign policy, particularly with kidnapping former head of state of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. And he honored a couple of military veterans that were 100 years of age, which was quite cool to see. So that's just a quick little recap of the president's speech. However, this morning I did another live stream, walked around the Capitol, the Supreme Court, chatted with some of you guys, met some new people, did a little recap of the address. So you'll definitely want to check that out. And as well, so I was at work earlier today, and one of my coworkers rushed in and said, I just saw dozens, if not hundreds, a stampede of anti-ICE activists walk across the front doors of the office where we work. I'm like, wow, it's time to go investigate, check out what's going on. I went to the event, which was at the same property where the anti-Iranian regime protest was on Sunday. If you didn't check that out, you should check it out. However, we talked to some of these people it was a peaceful protest. It wasn't like Minneapolis by any means, but it was a peaceful demonstration. I was able to have productive dialogue, I would say, with a lot of the rally goers. And I'll be sure to get clips out for those man on the street interviews in the next couple of hours, actually. But by tomorrow afternoon, for sure. Actually, was able to do man on the street with a congressman from Michigan. The name slips my mind in particular, but it's the gentleman. Sean Hannity roasted him probably 2 to 3 weeks ago on the same issue of illegal immigration. So I'll definitely get that clip out for you guys as well. Okay, so we've covered stuff we've done at GMO Sports. I listened to that, absolutely. Yeah, and thank you for being on the stream earlier today. And we have at Beth B4J8Z. Good evening, Beth. Thank you for joining the stream. tonight. We're already pretty strong, guys, right? So the last couple of days, I should say last couple of weeks in particular, we've expanded the growth, we've accelerated the growth of the channel beyond at a much higher speed than the first couple of months. And what do I mean by that? We're talking about we're netting 5 to 10 new subscribers on a daily basis now. We are rapidly ascending. We're cracking through the YouTube algorithm, which will reaching people that want to become awoken. So we're at around 350. That's our hover range right now. Not particularly fixated on a particular number, but just a little update for you guys as the Awoken community continues to expand. Okay, so if it's your first time listening to the live stream, or if you're listening to this the next day on Spotify or Rumble, please smash that like button. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Share this channel and stream or episode with anybody that you may feel needs to become awoken themselves, or may just particularly be interested in politics and Washington, D.C. politics. Excuse me. Here, I got to check out. Yes, and we just had a fan text in. Shri Thondar, the member of Congress I spoke to earlier today, I believe from Michigan's 12th district. It was a polite, gentle interaction. I used to work in the Senate, right? I know what it's like for, to want to protect a member of Congress. So I wasn't trying to be anything too outrageous there for sure. But, you can find the channel on YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, Facebook, Instagram, X, and Twitch. We're on seven different platforms at the current moment. And we have a new comment from @NicholasAlexander940. Great show. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thank you for tuning into the stream this evening. Okay, so now, I got the good old housekeeping out of the way. And I want to, so before I bring on our special guest for the evening, Nathan, my friend Nathan, know him from DCYR. We're both involved in DC politics here in the nation's capital. Just wanted to do a little preview of some of the events we're going to be discussing. So there's a huge, you could even say crisis, I'd say right now, with the House GOP. And we've covered this before on the show. A couple of weeks ago, you had Marjorie Taylor Greene, the former congresswoman from Georgia. She resigned. And then you had Doug LaMaffa, the former congressman from California. He passed away a couple of days after that. So that shrunk the GOP majority much faster than I believe the speaker had. Never that you want to project your majority is going to shrink. But the speaker was at a kind of a fork in the road to where if you lose Thomas Massie, then I believe you can only lose one more vote after him. So the speaker he's kind of drying out for votes. He needs more members, part of the conference, the GOP conference. I believe there's 218 currently elected in office members in the GOP conference in the House of Representatives. So you have this, I should say, scandal. There's probably a more proper term for it, but with Congressman Gonzalez of Texas 23rd District um, this last week and a half, and there's some pretty serious uh, allegations, if not some evidence has been shown to show that there's some wrongdoing or at least unethical practices done by the congressman. We will expand more on that this evening, but without further ado, want to bring on our fourth guest of the Awoken with Aulden program, my pal Nathan Worcester of. Here we go. All right, we got him here. Welcome, Nathan. Welcome to the Awoken.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, if you want 1 minute to tell the Awoken about yourself and what you're all about, and yeah, get after it.
Sure. So I am also in DC here. Not a member of DCYRs, but they've always been great hosts to me and getting to know the city. I've actually only been here for about a year and some change, but covering politics, covering also Texas politics, especially the Senate race. So, as someone who spends a fair amount of time in the Capitol, I've been tracking the races. Also, I don't want to get ahead of our skis here on this, but both John Cornyn and Jasmine Crockett, who are two contenders in two of the primaries, the Republican and the Democratic primary, respectively, in the Senate. They are around. I don't want to dive too much into the weeds here, but we might not get a chance on Capitol Hill to see Crockett again ahead of the primary election day, which is going to be March 4th, or rather March 3rd. Early voting is only until February 27th, and then all the Texas races, all of those are going to be over until that final primary day. And we'll get into this. I can say that for many of these races, but especially the Senate race, there has been a lot of attention. The Senate race is now the most expensive in history, according to Ad Impact. So plenty to dive into with you, Alden.
Absolutely, and I saw that article actually earlier today that what it's $110 million has been spent. Like that's, I wish I had $110 million right now.
And there's money coming for all of the candidates or against all of the candidates, but it's worth noting that the Republican candidate Cornyn, he has really been the biggest chunk there, something on the order of 60 million, if not more, at this point. And a lot of that is coming from establishment Republican sources, the Republicans' Senate campaign wing, also the Senate Leadership Fund, I believe, and then allied groups. So that's raised questions about some of the intensity of the campaigning we've seen, some of the attacks on all sides, but especially between Cornyn and Paxton, though between Hunt and Cornyn as well. That's Wesley Hunt, another member of Congress, another person I should say that it's possible to run into on the Hill. That has raised questions about once we actually come into the likely runoff election after this, assuming that no one gets above 50% in that Senate race. Maybe then in the runoff, or maybe then in the general election, some of those attacks, maybe they could be a turnoff to voters. But certainly, just to leave you with this, I was in Texas recently speaking to people at a Wesley Hunt event. This was a sheriff's breakfast where he appeared alongside a few other candidates. And I spoke to one and I just put it to her, doesn't it seem like this is sort of a knives out, vicious contest? And her response was, well, that's what we like to see here. This is the job interview right now. So ultimately, Republicans, she thinks, will unify once it comes time for the general election. That being said, and we can get into this more, but I think among Republicans in general, there's concern about enthusiasm ahead of the midterms. Is this going to be a repeat of 2018? Or will it maybe be for Republicans more like 2022 was for Democrats, where there was less of a red wave than a red trickle, and we don't see the sort of dramatic changes that some people are anticipating?
I think you make a great point there because there's so few competitive districts anymore, right? With all of the as in Texas itself, the redistricting in the Lone Star State and California, and attempts in Indiana and Maryland, you're just seeing all of these. It's almost like a nuclear arms race a little bit with
Yes.
redistricting. Mm-hmm.
I've used that exact comparison before. There are other states as well that have been pursuing it. I think, and I could be wrong here, I think this will ultimately, depending upon how everything works out, but at this point, it looks like it might leave the Republicans with a slight edge when it comes to just the, party versus party redistricting war. But that being said, there has been the case of the map in Virginia that has met with recently some opposition in the courts. People who have looked at it, especially people in Virginia, they'll see what people have compared to like sort of a lobster, where you have this tiny little sliver of deep blue Northern Virginia, and then you have these two claws coming out deep into rural Virginia. So if a map like that ends up holding up, it would, for many rural Virginians, it would effectively be disenfranchising them, because they would have to share a member of Congress with someone selected from hundreds of miles away. This is something coming, of course, from the Virginia legislature, which Aulden, I'm guessing you're well aware, in the recent 2025 elections, Democrats scored some big wins there, and that's part of why they've been able to be so aggressive. Maybe lessons could be learned there on the GOP side about just how quickly things can change when Republicans do not turn out, even if Trump is not on the ballot.
Certainly, and you make an excellent point with what the Democrats, they gained a dozen, or they almost got a supermajority, if not a supermajority, in the House of Delegates. Spanberger won much easier than I think anybody even would have expected. So that's a good wake up call to the GOP if they kind of take things easy for a cycle.
Yeah, it's been interesting for me to track that, and in Texas, we can talk about some of the other races, but right now the big discussion on Twitter is about this University of Texas poll that came out, which was, I believe, based upon surveys taken just before the start of early voting, so just before, I believe, February 17th, and in the Senate race, you have Crockett way ahead of James Tallarico, the, I believe, state representative. And then in the AG race, you have Aaron Wrights finishing well behind some of the other contenders there. That would be Representative Chip Roy, also someone you'll run into on Capitol Hill, kind of a well-known figure for his disputes as a fiscal conservative with Democrats, but even with Republicans over the past few years when it comes to things like the One Big Beautiful Bill. And then you have Mays Middleton, who is another, I believe, state legislator in Texas, someone who, I don't know how you see it, but I think comes from maybe more, Texas Public Policy Foundation, fairly conservative libertarian wing. But he has actually been attacking Trump, or I should say he has been attacking Chip Roy over some of those intra-Republican disputes, suggesting that he has not shown himself to be MAGA enough, not conservative in the right way. And there again, you have sort of within the party rather strong and forceful rhetoric and fighting going on.
There's always too much of that. It feels like it's like nobody can ever heal before trying to go on to the general election. Absolutely. Okay, I will. All right, everybody. I'm gonna get our slide deck added to the stage for this evening. Let's. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, everybody, we are as here. Actually, I'm gonna make the comment section a little smaller. That's a little far. But we will. Let's go to. Let's do that. Okay, perfect. So yeah, everybody, I've mentioned this a couple times on the show now that the Texas GOP, the Senate primary, is really the main the main card for this UFC fight. Right? We have everything else is really the pre-fight up to this Texas GOP Senate primary with Paxton and Cornyn in particular Hunt just kind of throws a little wrench into the thing, maybe prevents an outright winner on Tuesday, but we're going to be doing a much deeper dive into this very important primary. Also on Tuesday, I think you have Illinois and Arkansas, or North Carolina and Arkansas.
North Carolina. That's going to be the big one. And in the first district, Don Davis isn't facing a primary, but there are 5 Republicans now all vying for that district, which, again, thanks to redistricting that recently took place, it's now leaning more to the GOP. Again, we'll have that sort of tailwind because it's the midterms. So right now, Cook Political Report has it leaning to the Democrats, but Republicans are certainly hoping to get it. If you look at some of the ways that Don Davis has voted in the House recently, you can tell he is very concerned about losing that seat. He is definitely voting with the president, voting with the Republicans more than one might expect.
Absolutely, and something that a couple, like the weekend before the 24 election, I there was a deployment North NCO1, and a bunch of buddies and we knocked doors for Buckout, and that back then that was when it was the true like 50-50 like actual coin flip district, but now it seems, to your point, that Davis is a little disadvantaged at the moment.
It's a pickup opportunity for sure.
Yeah.
I would say that,
Yeah.
when I look at North Carolina, I do see some of the polling, Whatley versus Cooper for that Senate race. And I think in that state, that's kind of the main card for a lot of voters. Things could strengthen for Whatley, but if we see Cooper, who has been a fairly popular governor, from my understanding, even someone I think could be presidential timber down the line, maybe he will draw people who will then vote down the ballot for Davis. That being said, it's a number of months before the election, and certainly we could see a lot of money going in there to change things in North Carolina once we get into the general election cycle. And that goes for Don Davis's seat too.
No kidding there for sure. Alrighty, everybody, we are going to head into the first slide of the evening. So just a quick little overview of the election next Tuesday. As you've heard us already discuss tonight, there is the mid-decade redistricting with all, I believe, 38 U.S. South, Texas, a very large state, second to California in terms of representatives and the lower chamber of Congress. So now, I believe 5 Democratic districts in particular were really carved, or at least stabbed at. The Senate primary is, for the GOP, is the biggest contest, the main card of the UFC fight. And there's some, especially with even the Mexico situation happening with the cartel violence, I'm sure that has to put pressure on some of the districts more on the southern border. So, a lot of stuff going on there. So, Nathan, you have any general points go along with these?
Yeah, I think there's no question that the districts in Texas are ones where, based on that new map, Republicans are hoping that regardless of the turnout situation, we're going to see some significant wins. No question that those southwestern border districts are going to be the focus of a lot of campaigning. I think you're going to see Democrats trying to make the case against ICE or against some of the immigration enforcement we've seen from the Trump administration. But on the other hand, people living in Henry Whalar's district, to name just one, people living there with some of that cartel violence. Also, a lot of families who might have family members working for the Border Patrol or who are linked in there in a way that I think people who don't live near the border just might not be cognizant of. That might tip the scales. And notably, we can get into this later, but Whalar's Republican opponent is someone who was formerly a Democrat, I believe a judge, someone who's known in the district. I'm wondering, not having been down there, but I'm wondering if that could also work in his favor, the fact that he has some name recognition in that part of Texas.
I think you got it there with yeah, Waylar in particular. You have and we'll get into him a little bit later, but the charges dropped by POTUS. I thought that was that's something we'll dig into here in a
Hmm.
couple minutes. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, excellent. So here's the main card, everybody, right? Where it's hard to not think about this. The first thing when you hear about the Texas primary next week, these three main candidates. John Cornyn, he's the incumbent, so he has the incumbency advantage. Lots of ties to the establishment. Ran for, I believe, last cycle ran for majority leader. Even I think he got second. Maybe I think Rick Scott got third, and then Cornyn got second, but Thune ultimately won. But Paxton is more the maybe trying to be a little further to the right, maybe more Trumpy, Trump 2016 energy a little bit. And then you have Hunt, more the taking a stab at it, but has that military background, right? So he has an impressive record.
West Point
Yep.
flew a helicopter in Iraq, I believe. Yeah, sort of unfamiliar though to voters in the way that Paxton and Cornyn, they're known quantities throughout Texas.
Yep. Yeah, known quantities. They're statewide office holders. They have been for a minute. It's not like they're brand new, so they're um, not an artifact necessarily, but they're definitely, you've seen their name on the ballot a couple of times now. And we will, but yeah, we're going to really see how with this race in particular, it will kind of have a future, I'd say a future calling for what maybe the Texas GOP becomes, or maybe currently is, and maybe just hasn't expressed itself in that way. Let's dig in a little more into John Cornyn, the incumbent senator, right? As Nathan pointed out, he has a lot of ties with the finances, some PACs, some whether it's within the institution, the itself, and Congress, or the NRCC, NRSC, the big dogs on Cap Hill.
Hmm.
Um, and he has maybe a more calming method to the voters that, hey, I've been here, almost like the devil you know analogy, that, hey, I've been here for since 2002, I believe now. Just trust me one more, I can get us across one more time, kind of deal.
That I think is the pitch that he's making. When I attended his campaign event in Austin, which is one of the places where he began this tour during the week that early voting began, incidentally, a week that the Senate was out of session, he brought out former Governor Rick Perry, who made more or less that same case, made essentially, without making it terribly explicit, the case that you have in John Cornyn someone who has no serious accusations leveled against him that go to his moral character. And we can get into some of his votes and where I think a lot of conservatives would raise their eyebrows. But Perry was pitching him as someone that he has worked with and trusted. And for a lot of voters, of course, that'll seem like someone from the swamp, someone who has been kind of absorbed into the institutions, into Washington. Even before that, he was briefly Attorney General. He also held other positions. So I believe he's been in some form of elected office or other for about 4 decades. This is someone who has been, whether in Austin or in Washington, D.C., pretty well ensconced in politics. And so he has sought to stress things like, in general, the fact that he has voted with President Trump, the fact that Trump did previously endorse him, though notably Trump has not endorsed anybody explicitly as a separate candidate this time. His comment on this race has been, "I like all of them," which is very reminiscent of, if you recall, the Missouri Republican primary, I believe it was in 2022, where the two main candidates were Eric Schmidt, who became senator, and then Eric Greitens, who was campaigning with President Trump's son, Don Jr., Trump endorsed Eric, and he didn't specify a last name. I believe there might have even been another Eric in the race as well. So I think we're seeing a similar energy here. We can get into what Trump's opinion of Cornyn is. On the one hand, I think, especially in the second Trump term, we've seen him warm up to the Senate, or at least I think with Thune, my sense, and tell me if you disagree, but my sense is that there is not the sort of antagonism that there was when Mitch McConnell was the Republican leader in the Senate. And so we have Trump, golfing with Lindsey Graham. Trump is, I think when it comes to leadership, I'm speculating here, but maybe some of leadership's considerations, he's more responsive to that than he might have been in the past. On the other hand, after in 2022, Cornyn supported this bipartisan gun control legislation, the Safer Communities Act, which expanded background checks and stepped up mental health treatment and closed what was known, I believe, as the boyfriend loophole when it came to guns. Generally, things that a lot of conservatives, Second Amendment advocates don't like. I think Trump at the time called him a rhino. So there's definitely been antagonism in the past. On the other hand, it's both telling that Trump has not come out against him, also telling that this is an incumbent who is not being endorsed by the president. I think this is something that Susan Collins shares. That might actually benefit her, incidentally, in a state like Maine. But for Cornyn, that's a bit of a stinging blow, I think, and certainly put some wind into Chip Roy's, or rather, not Chip Roy's sails, into Ken Paxton's sails. I don't know how much wind there is in Chip Roy's sails at the moment when it comes to Trump.
Certainly, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the establishment position the president holds this term than compared to last term, right? You hear there seemed to be a more public bunch of spouting and disagreement with McConnell back in, especially with the Obamacare vote. There hasn't been anything that dramatic this cycle yet, at least for the Senate and House GOP, I'd say. And you're also looking at, with Trump trying to maybe play both sides of establishment and new right, maybe, let's just say the other side is new right for the conversation, that Cornyn is, he doesn't want to throw Cornyn under the bus, but he also knows he can't upset the maybe more populist or further right in the GOP as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I'm also just thinking of some of the blowups over the past few months between what one might call more populist elements in the GOP, MTG leaving Congress. We've seen the tension with Thomas Massie, although I think it is a fair question to ask if Thomas Massie is someone who really falls within the MAGA umbrella in a conventional way. There's a sense we could go very deep into this, but Thomas Massie in some ways is like the purified version of a certain kind of Tea Party, more libertarian strain in the Republican Party that has been absorbed into MAGA, has a lot to do with MAGA, but different energy than we've seen in 2026. And I will say, going to that question of Cornyn's record, when it comes to those institutional affiliations, those tendencies, when it comes to votes, Heritage Action, I don't know how up to date this is, but in at least one rating of his record, they gave him a pretty low grade. And to a large extent, it was for things like going along with Biden era budgets, going along with sort of as usual Washington. And so this is the set of trade-offs, I suppose, that when you're looking at the Senate in general as opposed to the House, there's a reason that it tends to be a more moderate body. It tends to have, on the one hand, fewer strong conservatives, on the other hand, fewer strong progressives, people on the left. That I think influences why you have more, maybe relatively more Susan Collinses or John Cornyn's than you do in the House. At least that's the way that I've tended to see it.
Right, and when you mentioned the bipartisan, the gun safety bill or whatever, another name that came to mind immediately was Tom Tillis
Hmm.
And we see what's happening to him, and right now he's not even going to try for re-election because of votes like that and other public disagreements with POTUS.
Yeah, it's striking. He has chosen that road, but on the other hand, to bring it around to a Massey comparison, we have Rand Paul still in the Senate, still someone who has not announced any plans to retire. And then looking at a state like Maine, looking at a state like Alaska to some extent, I think you do assess. Okay, there's some Republicans who could win in a more conservative state, perhaps. I would say Texas, but let's just say more safely. I was going to say Utah. Uh, let's say maybe South Carolina or more conservative states, as opposed to how can you win as a Republican in Maine or in Ohio or, well, yeah, for that matter, a whole lot of states that could be more competitive or less competitive depending upon the year. A New Hampshire in the right cycle.
Certainly, and that's a lot of great points there. And we're going to see with the midterms, like Collins has to run the next Republican nominee, whether it's Michael Watley, probably going to be Watley. There's going to some feet are going to be held to the fire.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm. Excellent. And let's take a look at the Ken Paxton, the incumbent Attorney General of Texas. He had this impeachment battle, I remember, occur around maybe a little over a year to a couple years ago now. And you also saw, I believe, there was something that had to do with the Ten Commandments that Cornyn hit Paxton on. I can't remember the exact details with that. But Paxton has, over the years, riding on the coattails, I'd say, of Greg Abbott, has been able to kind of rise as his own independent figure within Lone Star State politics.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. And even in the days and weeks up to early voting, and we're still seeing it now, he's come out with a number of actions that I think are aimed at boosting that record, that reputation as a conservative legal leader. Things like, for example, he ended up rescinding an order from Cornyn that he said facilitated the acquisition of acquisition of occupational licenses by illegal immigrants by not requiring social security numbers. And this is something that the Cornyn campaign, the Cornyn camp has disputed, but goes to that point of Paxton building that reputation and surviving the impeachment. I think surviving a lot over the years, it's fair to say. And so people will make the comparison to President Trump, someone who has survived multiple impeachments. The Cornyn campaign has been increasingly strong in terms of their messaging on this. I don't know if you've seen a recent ad that came out, but they draw attention to Ken Paxton's divorce. They draw attention to a lot of that in, I think, an attempt to very strongly in these final hours, with, again, a lot of money behind them, bring it home for Cornyn with enough primary voters. And again, this brings us back to that question of, well, I think if Paxton, who is narrowly leading in most of the polls I see, if he ends up being the nominee after a contested runoff, I just wonder how that's going to ultimately play in the general election. That kind of messaging hanging around in the air.
That's something I've thought about a lot as well, especially with preparing for this show tonight. Is that, let's say you have, if the, kind of like a sports parlay, if the Democratic messaging, the Democrats start getting really excited come towards this fall, Crockett is able to build on her personal appeal and personality. Is there a chance that she could somehow squeeze by with maybe a 49.5% kind of vote victory? Maybe not even a majority for the general, but somebody that, if the circumstances are all correct, that could, if she can find something on Paxton or character assassinate him more than Cornyn is, who knows? It's not over till the fat lady sings.
Although I should say that Crockett, I think, is uniquely positioned to face that same sort of scrutiny. I haven't read it, but there was an article that just came out investigating her crypto transactions, which again gets to sort of I think from the Democratic side, from the side of a lot of institutional Washington and the Democrats who I think would much prefer to see Tallarico win. Uh, it seems like attempting to reproduce the Beto O'Rourke playbook with him. He lost against Ted Cruz, who was an incumbent, but it was by the standards of Texas a pretty narrow loss. I think something on the order of 2%. That was the midterms of the first Trump administration. In 2024, when Texas overwhelmingly voted for President Trump, Colin Allred, who was initially a candidate in this race on the Democratic side and then dropped out and kind of threw a wrench in the works for Mr. Tallarico. We can talk about that later, but in that race, Allred lost pretty decisively, and so that I think speaks to just how even in such a circumstance, I guess I would not anticipate Crockett beating a Paxton or Tallarico, but Texas is certainly not a state that one could write off. Hasn't elected a statewide Republican in decades. Hasn't elected a statewide Democrat in decades. Has not elected a Democrat to the Senate in, I think, since the mid 1990s. So, very still a very difficult situation. Had a lot of conversations with early voters, with early voter Democrats who acknowledged to me that yes, this is tough. Maybe with the right sort of Beto O'Rourke-ish figure, which they see James Tallarico as, at least Austin liberals, maybe with someone like that they could win. But it's not something that would be easy, even with a lot of money and even with the potential turnout advantages. This would be even in the most favorable environment for Democrats, it would be an uphill climb with the candidate that they see for the most part is the stronger one against a Republican.
Right, and the president, blew Harris out of the water. Essentially, undid a decade of progress from Texas Democrats in one night, I'd say.
Yes, no, they were very excited about those midterm wins that they had during his first administration. But you look at where we see Texas now, especially after the redistricting, and it's just getting even with the midterms, if they're less favorable for the Republicans, it's getting redder and redder. And so, as you say, Paxton appearing as perhaps the favorite. Certainly, we'll see what happens if there's a runoff. But with Paxton emerging, it does seem as though the Texas of George W. Bush and John Cornyn might be behind us, and we might be moving towards. I think this might just reflect what's happening nationally. More polarized, more conservative Republicans, and then more polarized liberal Democrats. And just depending upon who has more of the state, you can end up in a situation where a state that's almost, I don't know if I'd call Virginia almost 50-50, but one that's not a strongly blue state. You have the legislature attempting to put in place a map that basically disenfranchises Republicans. And then on the other hand, you could see the same phenomenon. So that if that holds, I would expect Texas to, maybe it won't give us a surprise in November. Certainly, it seems like a good way if you're a Democrat and you want to have Republicans spend money somewhere that should be relatively safe for them rather than in a North Carolina or a Maine. It's good, I suppose, to build a lot of momentum behind a candidate, get him on the Colbert Report, develop some media attention, develop this kind of storyline around him. That's better than sustained attention to and funding for the most competitive, the most challenging races.
Right, and the Colbert, you just have to get them on those nighttime talk shows and get some of their voters onto it. So something that Nathan and I alluded to a little bit ago is that with Hunt being in the mix, that there might not be a candidate that wins outright on Tuesday. That's a serious consideration we need to take into account. And with the risk of a runoff, it could be an advantage to either of the two main candidates or a disadvantage to either two. Is there one? So we see with Paxton in particular, maybe he has like the higher intensity some of the more maybe grassroots excitement rather, with Paxton having maybe more of the money and more of the establishment backing. Do you think?
Or Cornyn, rather.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, with Cornyn having more of the institutional establishment kind of money and backing, would is there a candidate that you think would be better off with a runoff occurring?
That's a good question. I think that a runoff would, on the one hand, it depends to some extent, not entirely, on what Wesley Hunt does afterwards. And I spoke to him at that sheriff's breakfast I mentioned and put it to him, in the event of a runoff, who do you think you would back? He told me, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, but I certainly won't be endorsing John Cornyn. So that would certainly be interesting, could consolidate some of the energy behind Paxton. On the other hand, we've already seen a lot of spending, a lot of fundraising from Cornyn. And so maybe we would see those same institutional actors. One might argue this is throwing good money after bad at a certain point, but if they really don't want to see Paxton win, if they really either fear what he would be in the Senate or fear that he will lose in November, or whatever's motivating them, they could continue to step that up. They could continue to make it more challenging. I do think, on balance, for an incumbent to suffer something like that, losing or not outright winning that initial election and being forced into a runoff, I do think it makes them look more vulnerable. And Paxton has a lot of ground to cover when it comes to fundraising. He did get the Turning Point endorsement, which is big when it comes to having a ground game. Certainly a signal to get back to that point of Trump kind of playing both sides, that at least one wing of the modern conservative movement, the modern GOP that has been very aligned with the president, they are throwing their weight behind Paxton rather than Cornyn. So I think in general a runoff, particularly if we see Hunt endorse Paxton, and then if we see Paxton somehow able to summon more money, more support, kind of close the perception gap, maybe in some respect, that runoff condition could favor him. But on the other hand, again, we've seen a lot of these big time Republican organizations and donors hoping to rescue John Cornyn. So maybe that's not going to change. Maybe they're just going to somehow make this by far the most expensive Senate race of all time, rather than simply the most expensive, I should say, Senate primary of all time. I wonder if this would be counted as a separate race, the runoff. But if there's a separate category for runoffs when it comes to the most expensive of all time, maybe this will end up being a contender for that as well, depending on just how intense things get.
I think the category where you would insert that is if you consider a runoff like sudden death overtime, or if it's like the next season, like if our game over and we're starting a new game in 5 to 6 weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Tremendous. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Republicans tonight. Still want to touch up on the Democrats a little bit. Nathan has mentioned the two main candidates, essentially for the Democratic nomination, Jasmine Crockett, and the state House member running against Crockett. We're seeing Dems maybe trying to position him as the next Beto O'Rourke. Seems to be a young guy, seems to be maybe hip with the new generation, something like that.
Well, I don't know how many of the new generation are watching Colbert, which I suppose it's now the Late Show rather than the Colbert Report. But interestingly, he was also on the Joe Rogan show in 2025, and this was before he announced his candidacy, but kind of speaks to the fact that he's been building or trying to build this brand that reaches younger people, also through a TikTok channel that has gotten significant attention. And I would say with social media generally, but in particular TikTok, I always kind of look askance at like how much of what we're seeing is organic and how much could it be big money in some way or other factors promoting a particular candidate. But that being said, there's a lot of energy behind him. I can say, having spoken to early voters in Austin, which again is like the Tallarico heartland, I heard a lot of Democrats saying, well, I like Crockett, would be great to have her as senator. I don't think Texas is ready to elect her. I think Tallarico stands a better chance of actually getting the nomination and then actually being able to win in the general election. Crockett is someone who, I think having established this brand for herself, being sort of a Democratic firebrand and in sort of a parallel vein to MTG when she was in Congress, famously having some exchanges there. She is someone who has not been afraid to strike or strike back at Tallarico. And one could argue that the first serious attack came from Colin Allred releasing a video on Twitter where he accused Tallarico, based on a conversation that apparently Crockett had with Tallarico, of describing him as a mediocre black man, which then sort of set the tone for this contestation. The Tallarico campaign has denied that, said it was a mischaracterization of a private conversation. Meanwhile, we've seen Big PAC behind Tallarico, and I should note Tallarico has said he wants to get big money out of politics, wants to get things like PACs out of politics, but he's the one in this contest who has the big money. A PAC associated with him producing its own attack ad against Jasmine Crockett, something she raised issues with. Again, really, we've mentioned some of the sparring between the Republicans. There's been a lot of that with the Democrats as well, and I would not underestimate that as a factor when it comes to the both primary and then once we come to the general election. It's possible that some Democrats, some core elements of the base might feel somehow demoralized or less enthusiastic. I think especially if Tallarico is the nominee, maybe black voter turnout would not be what some Democrats hope, despite the expectation of the midterms being something of a strong showing for Democrats. I'll mention that in general, though, when we speak about these midterm signals, the early voting data I've seen, we have witnessed very strong turnout from Democrats in early voting. Republicans have not been turning out in nearly the same numbers for their contest. So some of that might just be for different behavior of these different blocks of voters, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Republican strategists are looking at that and worrying as to what it could mean for the future, especially on the heels of races like the big Virginia elections last year and some other pre-midterm elections that have come across in many cases as relatively strong performances from the Democrats.
Yeah, I think you make two great points there. I saw that article today that the early voting numbers is at a abnormally high, or like that it's concerning GOP strategists as well. And I think Crockett, I remember maybe around this time last year, maybe a couple months, maybe more like 9 months ago. Remember, she at least tried her maybe media breakout moment. I remember she had the derogatory comment against Governor Abbott, what he was a governor of Hot Wheels or something, alluding to his disability. He's in a wheelchair. So I think she tried maybe that media breakout moment, but I don't think it really worked out for her as maybe she was trying to hope.
No. I mean, it's interesting because you have willingness to be rather vicious when it comes to rhetoric, and maybe there's an attempt there to reproduce, okay, this is what it takes to get attention in 2025 or 2026. Again, sort of a parallel to some of the firebrands that we've seen on the right, which is interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what that translates to or does not translate to in this primary. She does, I should mention, have the backing of the Congressional Black Caucus. You certainly have not seen Jasmine Crockett, despite the fact that she doesn't have the organization that Tallarico does. And I should mention that in Austin, I saw a lot of his volunteers, big, showing of what you might call grassroots support there. But despite that, I think it would be unwise to underestimate the extent to which she does have her fans, maybe older voters, maybe a certain percentage of progressive voters. One of the big things people will be looking at is, okay, how are Latino voters in Texas going to break this time? Are we going to see, for example, some people who voted for Trump in the last election, are they going to be in the Democratic primary? Or would those people continue voting for the Republicans? Would they, if they are just not interested in politics, would they just not turn out at all? A lot to keep track of. And in general, I think the expectation, as you note, this suburban turnout for Tallarico in particular could be pretty crucial. And we're looking at not just Republican fragmentation here with the sort of high-profile Cornyn versus Paxton, then with Hunt in the mix sparring, but we're definitely seeing what could be signs of fragmentation or disunity among Democrats at a time when I think they really do not want to see that. They're really hoping to present the most unified front that they can. And Tallarico has been running his campaign not as aggressively against President Trump as perhaps Crockett or some other candidates would be. He's someone who has tried to make the case that he is a Christian. He's appealing to Christians in a state that is pretty religious. I should say, when I spoke to more Republican-leaning voters, early voters in Texas, didn't seem to be making much of an impact on them. I'm not sure how much that's going to matter, really, but sort of speaks to what we're seeing, I think, an attempt to reproduce that Beto O'Rourke phenomenon, but with a bit of a twist, the fact that this guy is a Presbyterian seminarian.
Politics is just like that. You're always trying to fit the mold a little bit. Excellent. So just a little recap on we're going to continue more breakdowns into some of the other key races and even scandals. But this is why does this race actually matter? Why are we having this episode? Why is this conversation worth having? Is that even just 5.5 years ago, coming up on 6 years, you have the Texas Senate election with Cruz and O'Rourke get razor thin almost for a Texas race. And it's also, I kind of alluded to this, you have the three main candidates all kind of having a different vision maybe for the future of conservative politics in the United States. Maybe how all three of them are going to play the border and other maybe red meat issues for the GOP voters. And as well, Nathan has alluded to it, just the sheer amount of money that is being spent in this campaign.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that, the contrast is a little less stark between Hunt and Paxton. And again, I'll be looking out to see where Paxton goes, where Hunt goes once it turns into a runoff. We even saw sort of a proxy battle in the State of the Union address. I was there in the House and watched both Cornyn arrive and also Attorney General Paxton, who was a guest of Troy Niels, who's more of a conservative in the House, but also someone who has been a very strong surrogate for President Trump, someone who is himself, I believe, not running for re-election, but his twin brother is going to be standing for that seat. So you mentioned this earlier, but when it comes to some of the things that Governor Abbott has done, declaring emergencies related to the border, contesting some of the policies under the Biden administration, there, I think it's fair to say, just more open border. The fact that they were creating this conflict between the state of Texas and the federal government, and Governor Abbott and Ken Paxton came out on one side of that. That's an area where I think Paxton has sought to draw a contrast. Again, to get into some of the material that the Paxton campaign has highlighted, not recently, but in the past, you have had Cornyn question the notion of a border wall. He in the past has taken maybe a softer stand on that issue, but on the other hand, I think like a lot of politicians, he adapts to the times, and so you've seen less out of him along those lines in the era of President Trump.
Right. That's a great little capstone for the Texas Senate race. I'm sure we'll probably touch up on it with the next couple of slides, but wanting for the audience wanting to advance past the Senate races, we just wanted to put a special emphasis on how the Senate races are the main card of the UFC fight. Okay, so I do have an additional, just kind of background slide for the Dems. Some additional context, especially with the urban areas for the Democrats. Because that's where we saw Beto O'Rourke's main voter turnout. I believe last time was the major urban and even suburban. We heard about this all the time back in 2018, how the battle for the suburbs was going to be the most important factor for the Democrats.
Absolutely. I think that at the same time, we're seeing some indications of strength from Crockett's candidacy. Again, a lot of the polling, including that University of Texas poll that you've seen, both Aaron Wright's on the Republican side and then Tallarico and others, I think, generally align with him, disputing on their side. You look at that and you look at, well, maybe you can bring out people from the suburbs, from areas around Houston, some of those suburbs that have elected Democrats in the past and that are in some cases still represented by that party. Maybe you can bring out people to really contest President Trump. But I still do wonder about the lasting, maybe demoralization that could come from Crockett losing. Maybe Crockett will ultimately be in a position to join with Tallarico if he is the nominee. I would expect Tallarico to avoid antagonizing Crockett if she is the nominee. But, Crockett also, it's worth noting that because of the redistricting, she kind of does not have a lot to lose. Because if she had not thrown her hat into the ring, she would have been contesting multiple Democrats in a new district. I believe Julia Johnston is her name. And this is the race that actually Colin Allred has jumped into, contesting that incumbent after this new map was laid out. So, Crockett, maybe there is a future for her in politics, maybe a future gubernatorial run, who knows? But really, there's not too many incentives for her to avoid being fairly aggressive and attempting to win here. And so I do wonder, could we be looking at, even as people are paying attention to this Republican fragmentation, maybe signs of a little less unity on the Democratic side with just how vicious that race has become, in addition to the Republican race.
Right, and when you have the minority party in the state trying to, whether they're seeking to flip the seat or becoming a little more powerful, if there's fragmentation and a divide in the primary, that only makes it that much harder. I remember I'm from Indiana originally, and in 2018, the Democrats, they had an incumbent with Joe. So this is a little different, but they had Joe Donnelly, the Democratic incumbent, and no one ran against him. They just let him kind of coast on to November. Didn't work out ultimately, but yeah, when you're the minority party, sometimes it helps to try and maybe make it a little more low key, just kind of protect, maybe coalesce around somebody and put all your eggs in one basket kind of deal.
Yeah, you need to be able to sing Kumbaya together, but we've seen signs. I'm just going to zoom out very briefly nationally of maybe some challenges with that for Democrats. John Fetterman has complained about more progressive elements in the party contesting him and some of his votes. He's occasionally voted with President Trump. He's occasionally, deviated to the right on issues, and that has stoked anger, dissatisfaction, maybe a primary challenge in the future. And then on the other hand, we have Jared Golden in the House, someone who is fairly unique from a district that has repeatedly voted for President Trump, but he is one of the last remaining Blue Dog Democrats and he's someone who announced that he would not be running for re-election. So, those are factors, those are challenges that Democrats, even as minorities in both the House and the Senate, and with some elements of the midterms looking favorable to them, they have had challenges getting their own house in order in a way that I think for any party it's a problem, but if you're a minority, it's especially acute.
Certainly. I believe. Okay, great. Okay, that is the last Texas Senate slide. Wanting to get into now, zoom in to some of the more district-wide congressional district challenges. Um, we see Congressman Dan Crenshaw was elected, I believe, after the 18 midterms. Seemed to have a very promising and maybe still potentially promising future in the House, but maybe has aggravated some in the GOP for one reason or another. But it actually, I believe I saw this earlier, like just a couple hours ago, that Ted Cruz endorsed the challenger to Dan Crenshaw, which was
Brandon Herrera, I believe,
correct.
the
Yeah,
gun guy,
yeah,
which is it's
Herrera.
that's very striking. Absolutely, Crenshaw's someone who, I'd contrast him with the Lindsey Graham, who, similar to Crenshaw, seen as a hawk, someone who's consistently supported things like funding for Ukraine, uh, NATO, generally supported more aggressive actions in the Middle East, you name it. And yet, Graham has been pretty effective, nimble at navigating the second administration. Someone who, when it comes to getting things across the line in the Senate, I think has played some sort of role, even to the point of with Arctic frost and the push that he's had to be able to collect damages potentially from the government related to that surveillance. He's gone it alone, and yet at the same time, he has not been attacked to the extent one might expect for that. But Crenshaw, by contrast, all of the baggage that has begun to surround him, I guess that's enough. I think, along with the fact that he has not been as vocal as some in supporting the president, that's enough to potentially sink him in the modern GOP. Just to share an anecdote, it was striking to me at a conference a few months ago. This was one with a group of, generally speaking, conservative, Trump critical voices. And Crenshaw was one of the people there, one of the speakers, which, in some states, in some races, there might be a lane for that. But in a place like Texas, up against Herrera, who very nearly defeated him in the last cycle, that's maybe a lot more challenging, a tightrope that's pretty hard to walk.
Right, and sometimes in politics, when it comes down, if you're only won by a small percentage in the last election, and you're trying to, if you're running the same play, it's almost like a sports team where you defeat the team the week prior, but they were injured or something like that. But now the
Yeah,
team's at full strength, and now you're running the same playbook. It's going to be, it's a troublesome outcome you're potentially facing.
absolutely.
So yeah, just wanted to touch up on that. I thought it was quite bizarre and telling that Cruz hasn't made an endorsement in the Senate race, as at least as of when we started this broadcast, but went against Dan Crenshaw in the House race. So
Another
yeah,
striking one to me, the Attorney General candidate, Chip Roy, who in the past has pretty strongly attacked Ken Paxton. He also declined to make an endorsement when I put it to him in the House. So a lot of
wow,
people are tiptoeing around that one.
certainly, yeah, that's um, yeah. Some of these races are just going to. That's why we're having this conversation. Is that it's worth for the Awoken to actually hear what's going on. So okay, let's the next House race and really the member more or less. Um, okay, we actually have a couple of comments to read. So at ZCVXS, Texas will be blue in November, and at Will Haynes TV 4944 says how can the Dems utilize Beto's game plan from 2020 for the 2026 Cornyn race? Do you think there's an avenue for Dems to um, utilize Beto's past efforts.
And I should just correct myself before we get into that, because there's some interesting questions and comments. The race that Crenshaw is in, he's facing Steve Toth, and Brandon Herrera is the opponent of Tony Gonzalez, the border district congressman who we're examining now. But yeah, it's going to be, to me, kind of fascinating to see exactly how the Beto playbook, if it's something that they've been able to kind of refine in this cycle, maybe through, I think, both the funding and the fact that, as I said previously, you're having more of an explicitly Christian pitch. Now, if you wanted to have a really strong candidate, he would be someone not from Austin, not someone who has that association across the state. If I were a Democrat recruiting somebody who could potentially win in a Senate race, I would try to find somebody from, I don't know, Lubbock or East Texas, also maybe a Latino candidate, or someone who just generally is not seen as, I think, representative of a very liberal culture that's not really representative of most of Texas, which is what you get in Austin. But yeah, I don't know if Texas will be blue in this upcoming election. It might be bluer than some Republicans would like, but especially with the redistricting, I think we're going to see nothing too far outside of the expectations that people have.
I think that's a very fair analysis there. But back to Mr. Gonzalez, this was something that a couple days ago, maybe even at the beginning of last week, if not late last week, saw these bombshell, and really sometimes on the show we'll joke about, but this is not a laughing matter at all. This is a pretty serious, resulted in the death of a young woman through a pretty horrible method of suicide, and yeah, just not a great look for the congressman at all. We see he has said it's maybe trying to take something out of the president's playbook, with maybe not a witch hunt, but like it's, all of a sudden it's coming out because of the campaign, the election is on the horizon.
There was some coverage of this a few months ago. I should say it's gotten renewed scrutiny in the past few days. There's been additional reporting delving into it, but this was not a new story. On the other hand, it didn't really take off a few months ago when it was first surfacing.
Wow. Yeah, that's why I wonder why I guess there wasn't an election within the next couple of days. But yeah, a very serious, yeah, like I weren't in the Senate before. There's obviously the ethics committee. There's other methods like no office relationships, even from staffer to staffer, for example. Like you just don't want to. It's a Pandora's box once you open something like that.
I believe it. It's again one of these situations where, and I should issue a more fulsome correction, because I believe it was Brandon Herrera who, in the previous election against Tony Gonzalez, not against Crenshaw, again to repeat, but against Gonzalez, he did very well. He only narrowly lost. So we are, looking at a much better environment for that candidate. And on the other hand, Gonzalez, Troy Nels, again the other day, he's not said that he should drop out, but he's essentially said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Gonzalez should, do what he thinks is best, or something to that effect. So we're not looking at the sort of support that I think Gonzalez would like after these revelations, after these details have become more public. And again, it's really hard to examine it. And I'll be cautious here, say allegations, accusations, but if there is truth to this, it's very, very hard to look at this and come away feeling comfortable.
Right. you said, it's just something that anybody reading this, I just imagine my mother reading this story. She'd be sick after reading this. You know what I mean? Just like any every everyday American would be like, what's going on here? You know, this is a little outrageous. Something needs has to be some kind of consequence from this up to a point.
And
Yeah,
looking at the redistricting, I imagine it might even be the environment in which you can look at a candidate like Tony Gonzalez, and the GOP establishment would be more comfortable with him not being their standard bearer. This, as I said, it's not totally new. There's new details, new reporting, but this stuff has been circulating for a while in some Texas media.
right. And yeah, you mentioned the comment from that one member expressing that the Congress, Mr. Gonzalez, should do what's best for him. But we have seen some prominent members of the more populist or like Lauren Boebert, Massey, Anna Paulina Luna, and I believe Tim Burchett maybe as well. A couple of those more well-known fellows within the GOP conference have called for Mr. Gonzalez to remove himself from the conference. So yeah, a lot of wild stuff going on with this. So yeah, we just felt that this was definitely worthy including in the show. Another member that is also under some alleged accusations of misconduct and unethical and even corruption, to that matter. This gentleman in particular, it's a little different because, well, he's actually angered some establishment Dems. I believe he was, well, I think he at least was or still is pro-life, one of the only Dems left in the caucus that holds that viewpoint. And as well, he was the only House member on the Democratic side to vote for the Save America Act, the House version of it that passed last week, 2 weeks ago. So he is, but he's been around since I think '02, maybe even before. But he's been around a while. So but he was pardoned by the president, which I think maybe made some heads turn with that. Like, why would the GOP and incumbent president let the hook off of a Democrat? Maybe that he's trying to unseat for the midterms.
Absolutely. I think that the fact that he has that record as a moderate, it's much like the case of Jared Golden. Different circumstances. Jared Golden does not have any corruption indictment, nothing of that sort surrounding him. But in general, we're seeing Democrats, even in cases where they might think, oh, well, we need to get this seat on our side. So even if this person doesn't vote with us every single time, we'd still rather have a D there than an R. Democrats, I think, influenced by the more progressive wing, they've just been more averse to supporting people like that. And so, yes, you have in the case of Huelar, I believe the Republican that he will almost certainly face is this judge, this local in, I believe it is Webb County, if I'm not mistaken, who is a known quantity, someone who has that name recognition. And again, there's nothing equivalent to the sort of contest that we're seeing elsewhere, like with Don Davis's seat in North Carolina. We're having a lot of Republicans seeking the opportunity to challenge him. Whereas, yes, in this part of Texas, as we were discussing earlier, I think some of the issues of cartel activity, some of the violence that's been associated with the border and the border policies we saw under President Biden, that might influence alongside whatever else we may be seeing from this state amidst redistricting that could drive things in a more Republican direction. And with Huelar as someone in a very tough spot, I do wonder the fact that he is the nominee, perhaps there's no stronger candidate that would have been facing the Republican choice in that case. So it's sort of interesting to consider, to speculate a bit on what we've seen in relation to him, and then what we could and will perhaps likely see once this comes down to the general election.
And Waylar, and I believe his district was one of the 5 that was severely altered through the redistricting push. So Waylar was already kind of
On the bubble, so to
yeah,
speak.
right, on the bubble, like trying to make the tournament for March Madness, like maybe trying to get in, maybe not. But yeah, Waylar he has the corruption stuff going on, but he does have that moderate record. He can show, hey, I will support the Save America Act. I can cross over where nobody else in my caucus may do the same. So it's going to be, we'll definitely keep a close eagle eye on this race for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be worth tracking, and certainly in the lame duck period, assuming he's not reelected and assuming we don't have something else happen when it comes to this district between now and election day, I do wonder what he might be saying about his party or just politics in general in Washington. I think if you want to look beneath the hood, maybe he's uniquely positioned to offer some of that perspective.
Absolutely. And let's go zoom back out to statewide. Some other maybe not as contentious but still worthy elections coming up with the current House member Chip Roy Freedom Caucus, the House sponsor of the Save America Act, trying to get that bill just passed the House a week ago or so, with Ken Paxton sprinting for the Senate. We now see, Roy trying to run for the state attorney general, head back to Austin. Seems like he does have some challengers, but they're really, I'm not sure if anyone else that doesn't follow Texas politics on a daily basis may really know about them, honestly.
Someone like Mays Middleton, for example. Aaron writes he has been doing his best to make himself known in this race, and internal Aaron Wright's polling, when they familiarize people with him, he looks okay. There's a lot of steps between that and, an actual winning candidacy. So, I wouldn't necessarily rule out the possibility of a runoff if, with all these candidates, we see Roy not able to make it over 50%. I think there's a very real possibility of that. It would likely then come down to Roy versus Middleton. But on the other hand, I think that Roy has had the challenge of occasionally seeming to at least oppose the president or oppose other Republicans when he wants something to be more fiscally conservative. For example, during the reconciliation bill battle, pushing for reforms to some energy credits, things of that nature. In recent months, however, I've noticed that in the context, for example, of the shutdown, the period leading up to the shutdown, and during the discussions that were taking place then, he was not the hardliner on some of these issues that he's been in the past. Perhaps that could be related to the fact that he was gearing up for this attorney general race. But someone who, again, as you say, he led the push on the Save America Act, voter ID, proof of citizenship when registering, key issues for Republicans, key issues for President Trump. I think it's a challenge to really seek to portray him as someone who is decidedly anti-Trump or anything of that sort. So I would expect him to ultimately be the winner. Could, of course, be quite competitive, could come to a runoff. And then in the general election, I think we could see something interesting, but certainly looks like Republicans are likely to walk away with it in November.
That's what it's seeming like. And something about Roy, we kind of touched up on this with maybe the president getting along with Senate leadership in the second term. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Roy was an early backer of Ron DeSantis, if I remember correctly, and actively pushed for his candidacy, but maybe has made amends, understanding that, hey, I still like Trump. You know, I've still served when I was in the Congress prior, or at least in Republican politics. So just another example of a member or a political figure adapting to the times. That's the name of the game in politics, as we all know.
I think that's very accurate, and certainly he was someone who I think ultimately, when it came even to the reconciliation battle, was pushing his side, and came away with what he said were enough concessions, or certainly enough where I think the Freedom Caucus didn't see themselves as defeated in that battle. They, of course, were contending with the Senate, where we tend to see these battles over and over again. On the House side, you have the Freedom Caucus and other fiscal conservatives. They want something, and often the White House wants something that's more conservative than the Senate can bear. And this was especially obvious looking at the actual appropriations bills that made it across the line as compared to what the House wanted to put forth, and what the White House initially presented. You're going to see, I think, the conditions for Chip Roy. I think the record that he owns is not one that looks terribly anti-MAGA, and he has, I think, with all of the things he's done in the House, he's built a statewide brand. He's known. He's also someone who was in Texas politics, known, I think, in Austin before he went to the House. So not totally unfamiliar either.
Great analysis there. Okay, I believe there's. Okay, and the last, maybe not the last race, but I believe this is Abbott. He's running for the fourth term now. He's been. I don't think. Are there not term limits for Texas? You can just keep running forever.
That's a great question. I don't know if they have term limits for the governor.
Yeah. Well, we at least know it's 4. If there are term limits, you can run for 16 years.
You can have an FDR tier time in office almost.
Right. Yeah. And what a actual cool symbolism with the two men there. We see Abbott, especially during the first Trump term and during the Biden admin, be outspoken for conservative priorities, particularly with the southern border. I remember a lot, and also some good old GOP priorities like school choice, tax reform. You know, the good old GOP ideals. And he's been able to keep the base to where he's never been threatened. I remember in the 2018 midterm year, it was all about O'Rourke and Cruz. Abbott was perfectly fine. He didn't have he could have slept in on election day and been just perfectly fine, you know. So
yes, I think that's accurate. I mean, you'll occasionally hear people on social media, they'll say on the conservative side he's not conservative enough in particular areas, but especially on the border, I think that he showed a willingness to go against the Biden administration, and then allegiance to President Trump. And generally speaking, in a state like Texas, given the composition of the legislature, he's not going to be hard pressed to have any battles, really. I suppose you have the whole internal politics of the Texas legislature, which can, within Republicans, that can get kind of contentious. But it does not surprise me. I think his Democratic opponent, Gina Hinojosa, I mean, I haven't seen any polling related to her, but certainly I don't imagine that she would be a boost to Tallarico or to Crockett specifically. I think if anything, it would be the opposite, depending upon how activated Democrats are when it comes to the Senate race.
I think that's a phenomenal point, almost a repeat of the 2018, right? The Senate candidate leads, and everyone else follows the coattails when it comes to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Had a fan text in, not able to. Um, Here, let me find the message. Okay, so a text message from the fan says, quote, "In its race for U.S. Senate, James Tallarico is trying to woo religious Texas voters by criticizing conservative Christian support for pro-life policies, traditional marriage, among other things. Instead, he is championing a non-traditional and progressive religious view on these topics. How effective do you think this approach will be, both in the Democrat primary and the general election?"
I think that on those specific issues, on life and then marriage, I guess there's always a chance that the midterm will be seen as a referendum on abortion, but this is not, as with the previous midterm, this is not coming after a major Supreme Court case. To my knowledge, and I might be wrong, I don't think there's been anything big happening in Texas on the legislative side that has raised that as an issue. So I don't think it would be a detriment to Republicans. I think there's a possibility, especially with things that we've heard from the current Pope and from some liberal Protestant leaders, but especially when it comes to the Pope, maybe on immigration policy, there could be some momentum associated with the case he's making. But I think in general, certainly when it comes to strongly conservative Republican voters, I don't think this is going to be persuasive. I'm not sure how many independents are also religious and also persuadable in the way that he might hope. But on the other hand, it sets a kind of conciliatory, or maybe I'm being generous there. It sets a tone that Tallarico's advocates might consider conciliatory. I think a lot of other people would look at what he's saying and they would find it to be inconsistent with Scripture, inconsistent with Christianity. You know, Texas does not seem like a state where mainline Presbyterianism is the dominant religious social force. So could this maybe move a few Hispanic voters in the Rio Grande Valley who otherwise would not be voting or might not vote for the Democrat? Maybe. I see it making a difference also nationally, I think, in terms of how Democrats think about attempting to run candidates who can contest the president. So maybe this is a sort of a model or a test run for a certain sort of 2028 candidate against a Vance or a Rubio. If Andy Beshear or Ken Cooper, someone like that, could make such a case, maybe that would influence things. But no, I don't know how much of an impact it's really going to have with the voters. I think it might be pretty marginal.
Great. And we have a few other comments and questions. Another question from @WillHaynesTV 4944 asks, "Do you see former GOP Congresswoman Maya Flores making a political comeback in the Texas Valley region?"
Yes, I believe she is a candidate again. She is, I think, running in one of these newly competitive districts. This is let me double check here. But yes, I think, and forgive me, I don't have perfect memory of this, but yes, if you see on FEC, she is fundraising as a candidate in the House for the 34th district. So someone who in this environment, I think it's entirely possible that she could get the nomination. She could maybe even win in the general. Yeah, I guess we do have to look though at overall trend of the midterms. If it's a very strong turnout year for Democrats, including in Texas, maybe she would still be out of luck. But these are possibilities that are opened up by the new map in Texas.
Yeah, the new map changes everything instantly, essentially. a couple compliments for and for both of us, but one directed towards you from at Nicholas Alexander 940. Great info from the guest, and at Ron Winant says great show with valuable information. And then a question from Nicholas Alexander 940. How are Texas House members and border districts responding to the administration's ICE and immigration policies at midterms near, given their large Latino constituencies? Anything in particular stand out to you?
I think you've seen, and I'm just going to make a broader comment and focus on some of the maybe less prominent negotiations, some of what we've seen on skilled worker visas, like the H-2 program. We've had out of Wisconsin, Derek Van Orden, but also someone in a very competitive district with a lot of dairy farms, a lot of workers who are not legally present in the country. You've seen a push to expand that. I think you have heard maybe more divergence on rhetoric, but then at the same time, we can look to how Republicans voted for the SAFE Act recently in the House. And in general, I think we've seen a fair amount of consistency with the overall Republican conference in the House, and then also with the Trump administration on these issues. I just to reiterate, I think that in these border districts, you have direct contact with cartels. You have a lot of people who might work with Border Patrol, or they're very familiar with it because it's just kind of an everyday thing there, and it has always been. So I think that to me, it's interesting to consider both those districts, but also what will this do in the Central Valley of California, or some other parts of the country that are maybe further from the border, where you don't have that special relationship with Border Patrol, and then a large Hispanic community and voters who might be responding negatively to the administration's immigration enforcement actions. I think that's worth watching. That's worth watching elsewhere in the state. I do have to wonder how much the border specifically is totally representative of Mexican American and other Hispanic voters across the country.
Right. I think maybe to try and answer their question is that I believe maybe in 2016 it had more more of a familiar basis with it, because like you saw Latino support higher for Clinton, but this last cycle you saw large a swing in a large chunk of particularly younger Latino voters, I believe, backed the president, and we saw the large shift away from Democratic gains in Texas statewide evaporate and fade away, with some of that Latino support collapsing.
I think that's a great point, and I'm not. I've never lived in Texas. I'm tracking this Senate race, but my general sense is there are certainly a lot of analysts out there who would like it to be the case that we'll see some collapse in Hispanic support in the midterms for President Trump. I imagine if we see a change, there will be from some of those same analysts a tendency to want to overgeneralize from the midterm versus another race where you have Trump on the ballot. And I don't know if we're going to see any sort of dramatic swing, especially among those younger voters, if they've been persuaded the first time and they were voting, and to a large extent, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them on the basis of the Biden administration's immigration policy. I feel like it would be difficult for them to necessarily just turn around and say, well, I voted for this, but now I don't like what I'm seeing.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a great point there, for sure. Alrighty. And more kind of looking forward a little bit, or really just maybe a capstone a little bit on what's happening with Texas, the state. We've mentioned a couple times tonight that even though maybe Democrats could be excited, or had been excited in past cycles about gains or excitement, that there's some realities in the sense immigration is still a top issue. We're seeing a massive. I, we haven't talked about this tonight, but a massive surge in population moving in from other western states into the Lone Star State. I believe what they're projected to gain four, maybe 3 to 4 seats after the census this cycle or this decade, not cycle.
In general, we're
Yeah.
seeing red states tend to gain, blue states tend to lose population. And if we were in the future to see a court decision uh, changing the way that the census is conducted, or also, affecting districts and affecting some of these dynamics that are influenced to some extent by the counting of people who are here illegally. Yes, I mean it's going to be, well, it could some of these could cut both ways, but in general, yeah, we're seeing a more red map, I think, emerge based on overall population trends. California losing people, New York not exactly gaining people, perhaps also losing people, and states like Texas and others in the Sun Belt generally gaining.
Absolutely, and I believe, yeah, if you on Twitter or online, you can see some maybe accounts that really zone in on the House reappointment schedule after the midterms, and it's I believe up to it can get to the point to where the Rust Belt becomes insignificant at a point to where the Republicans wouldn't need those states anymore with all of these electoral votes shifting away from Democratic states, which is a major concern long term for Democrats in the 2030s trying to recapture the White House.
The loss of the blue wall, and in general, I think dynamics that were projected uh, decades ago by political scientists. They thought that the United States, as it continues to change demographically, as it becomes more Hispanic, specifically, that the Republicans would just permanently lose their majority or their ability to compete. Whereas, and we'll have to see what happens in the midterms, but certainly 2024, President Trump's election raises some serious questions about that hypothesis. So you look to states like Texas, you look to Florida as well, now a deep red state. It certainly seems like the future of American politics is not one of a permanent Democratic majority. Definitely that, as you pointed out, blue wall in the Rust Belt and the upper Midwest will, maybe not as dramatically as some areas of the country, but certainly areas that people are paying attention to because they're swing districts or swing states in many cases. Those are likely to diminish in importance.
Right, and that it's only going to make the next couple of cycles much more exciting for people to participate in. Um, and believe, right, yeah, last one, just kind of a little March Madness bracket, just kind of bracket it all together a little bit with the election next week. There's we've talked about there's two major idea path that the GOP can take. Maybe you have the Cornyns hang on, or you have the Paxtons power through and take the reins. And then you also have a possibility to where we don't know who is the nominee until a week before June, the 26th of May. So,
Which I
yeah,
think that's going to happen. I think it's hard to imagine it not happening. I mean, Cornyn has said he's not going to debate anybody until the runoffs. With Wesley Hunt in the race, unless he's very, very insignificant, and either Paxton or Cornyn has a great night, it's looking more and more like we're going to see additional months of this kind of competition between the two big fighters.
right, and that's only going to if we thought this original primary competition was noteworthy. Just wait until you're seeing all those college graduation videos. Next thing you know, it's a campaign ad for either John Cornyn or Ken Paxton on the the television for sure.
Oh yeah, I'm sure in Texas you just will not be able to escape it.
No, yeah, being from southern Indiana, we get a lot of Kentucky TV ads for campaigns, and we had a bunch of Amy McGrath ads for the 2020 campaign, and I can just imagine those people in Houston and San Antonio and Texans throughout the Lone Star State that are just going to have to deal with the large amount of campaigning and advertisements heading their way.
Yeah, no, you look away from the commercial on TV where a lot of those ads are going. I think Cornyn is really helping to activate those TV watchers, and you look at your phone and you're gonna start getting the mobile ads. It's gonna be everywhere in Texas.
Is there? You mentioned a huge amount of money has been spent. Is there? Do you know maybe sectors it's being placed into, like TV or even print whether it's yard signs or campaign placards or whatever?
Yeah, so off the cuff comment, my understanding is that a fair amount of this is going into TV ads, and that's based on what Cornyn himself said at that Austin event. He was asked by reporters, why are you spending this much money? And he said, well, your TV stations, they're not exactly cheap if I'm looking to place ads. But if I were in the position of hoping to reach, I think maybe older voters, older Cornyn fans who will turn out and can be reached that way versus the sort of people who are looking at their devices and might be responsive to mobile ads. Yeah, I think it would make sense to try to hit those big markets, Dallas and San Antonio and Houston and Austin.
Certainly, and I remember just doing kind of research for fun throughout the years, learning about Texas politics. I think out of the 10 least populous counties in the U.S., aren't about half of them near that Oklahoma area, like that northwest spot. We're talking maybe 30 people live in these, like a handful of people, legit. So yeah, you definitely want to target those higher densely populated suburbs and cities.
Lot easier to get to those rural, or rather, I should say, those urban and especially suburban voters. And those rural voters, it was interesting at that Wesley Hunt event. This is in a tiny town called Trinity, Texas, which is in one of these small counties, not 30 people, but not large by the standards of Texas, which is, I believe, over 30 million. And I spoke to the sheriff, and he said he didn't make any sort of strong, decisive statement about the race, as I recall, but he said it was very nice, very flattering that someone like Wesley Hunt would come to a place this small, given just how big the state is. And as you say, how important getting people in like greater Fort Worth or greater Houston to vote is going to be, even for Republicans who tend to depend more on rural voters and voters out in the exurbs.
Excellent point. Yeah, and sometimes some of those candidates that are maybe Hunt understands he doesn't have the statewide name ID. He hasn't been on the statewide ballot. He only has his district. To where you need to show you're serious and you want to represent everybody. You go to those smaller counties. You go to the Lincoln Day breakfast or the Lincoln Day dinner, whatever event the county
Yeah.
GOP is hosting.
Classic retail politics. There's something, as someone following this stuff now for a few years myself, it is interesting getting out there and hearing, I like this candidate because he came to the Reagan dinner or he came to the Lincoln breakfast or whatever it is in my county, and then that actually made a difference for me.
Right, especially when maybe a statewide official wouldn't even consider going to it, right? So it's a personal little touch, for sure there.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if so, we'll open the floor up to additional questions for Mr. Worcester and myself, our wonderful guest tonight. Um, yeah, Nathan, you have any maybe closing comments or anything else you've been maybe you think you didn't mention before that might be a better time to mention or anything like that?
Well, I just, for the sake of posterity, or just for the sake of my own ego, I wanted to mention those two corrections again. I think the two key ones in that race with Dan Crenshaw, it is Steve Toth, who is his opponent, not Brandon Herrera. Brandon Herrera is the primary opponent against Tony Gonzalez in that district. And aside from that, I will say Texas is just such an interesting place, and I do see the parallels to Florida. It is a very big state. It's a place where going around there. This is true in a lot of places, but especially in Texas, there's just state pride out the wazoo. There was a woman I spoke to who said, if Texas were to secede and become independent again, I would be a Texas patriot first over a U.S. patriot, which, I'm not from Texas, so kind of raise my eyebrows at that. But I think to me, it's very interesting to see people try to capture a vision, try to evoke something that can really bring that forward. And I don't, despite the fact that Texas, if you look back over the decades, used to be a very strongly Democratic state, the state that produced President Lyndon Baines Johnson, state with many Democrats in the Senate and the House in the mid 20th century. I think that there's a kind of, there's a kind of forcefulness, there's a kind of energy there that Democrats struggle to capture. You contrast James Tellerico with up in Maine, Graham Plattner, another candidate who has some baggage, but at the same time, I think maybe he comes across as more of a populist. Maybe there's something there that for Republicans in Texas, if they're facing a Beto O'Rourke or if they're facing someone like Tellerico, maybe to a lesser extent to Colin Allred, who was a professional football player, but there's a bit of a gap between the way Texas likes to see itself and then the sort of Democrats who are running statewide. If I were a consultant for the Democrats, I might just say, maybe it's not quite enough to put somebody in like a cowboy hat or something and run them in a state like Texas. I think someone who maybe a voter, an independent voter, could look at and imagine this is someone that I could talk about the Alamo with, and they wouldn't judge me for it. Maybe that's the sort of thing that even Democrats, or I should say independents that Democrats want to get on board, that might be the sort of thing that they have to keep in mind. But that's a struggle for the Democrats in their modern party, their modern brand, the sort of people who want to vote for the Democrats, and maybe we'll see them taking away a positive lesson if Tellerico's the nominee and he does well. I mean, if Crockett is the nominee and she does well with her own particular energy, that would also be telling. That would also give us a sense of what the future of more populist, hard-edged, left-wing politics for the Democrats, what that could look like as well.
And I think that's a great way to put it. The cowboy hat reference, it almost reminds me a little bit somewhat of the camo hats for the Tim Walz camo hats and the 24 election a little bit.
Well, there's a sense in which, I'm imagining like a millennial consultant who would accurately think like, you go to Brooklyn or you go to certain places in this country, people would wear them, or at the very least, like this somehow fits into an aesthetic, but it just comes across as kind of hokey and inauthentic, I think, to a lot of voters, a lot of independents who you might be wanting to persuade with that sort of message. If it's something you can imagine, and this is an outdated, very millennial reference, but like Red Hook or Williamsburg, Brooklyn hipster wearing in the 2010s or the 2000s, if you can imagine them doing that, it might not be something that plays nationally.
Right, and sometimes some of these candidates, like I feel like they almost try too hard. So if you've lived there forever, you should naturally just kind of know what works, right? So,
yeah. Well, then we get back to Tellerico. He's someone who's been elected from Austin, and so what he does, what he has, works for people there. But that's just a tiny part of the state, and big increasingly you're seeing Democrats and Republicans representing very different groups, different areas, even, you know, rural versus urban America. So it can be hard to figure out how to bridge the gap in terms of how does something that works with one group reach the other. I'm trying to think of candidates who've been able to really bridge that, as opposed to merely intensifying turnout for their side or demoralizing the other side, or just appearing to be kind of not too offensive to anybody, which can also sometimes work. But it's hard to think of somebody who's really come up with style, a political aesthetic that can really stand above those divides.
Right, and you mentioned that, and like, even you think of someone like Susan Collins or someone like that, but she's not. She's just known for being able to vote her way out of it. I'd say in the Senate sometimes, that she can calculate, not upset enough. Like, I think she's still pro-choice, right, for the voting record in the Senate. So,
appropriations chair for a reason, though. I think she knows how to play the politics. And if you worked in the Senate, you'd probably have good observations on this. But my sense is that, you know, having been there for so long, and also people knowing how hard it would be to replace her in Maine, you know, she's built those relationships over the years. Most likely, even with the more conservative people, even if they might object to some of what's coming out of appropriations. And Maine is also just such a strange state. As I said, Jared Golden is from there, a Democrat in a very, you know, or at least fairly pro-Trump Republican district. It's hard to generalize from a state like that.
Yeah, I think Trump, he's won it the 3 times, and every time Golden has won the same concurrent election. So yeah, you have that. Yeah. And Collins, like, you have the lobster industry up there, with Collins being on appropriations. Like, we saw her, even if you read her comments or watch the short little interview she did walking in the basement of the Russell building, I believe it was, after she said she would co-sponsor the SAVE Act, she said the improvements to it from the last cycle was enough to get her on.
She found a way to try to find a moderate bridge or something like that. She found a way to, with her particular audience, with the stances that she tends to take, managed to make it palatable, I suppose, or hope to make it palatable for more liberal Mainers or others who might be deciding whether to vote for her in November. And she's a survivor, though, it should be said.
Yep, it's the name of the game is survival for Miss Collins of Maine. the name of the Maine game, I should say.
Or the main name of the game. I think there's a few ways to place it.
Much better. Yeah. Well, if anyone doesn't have any additional questions for Nathan and myself, Nathan, do you have a social media link you'd like to drop for people to find you, or where people can check out more of your work?
Sure. So you can find me on X or Twitter, however you like it. My handle is my first 2 initials and my last name. So NNWORCESTER. That's NNWORCESTER. And you can also just find me online. I'm a reporter, and I post a fair amount also on Twitter/X, including from the State of the Union. That was a very, very interesting thing to witness up close. Speaking of the Senate, seeing John Fetterman in a suit, among other things.
Right. Yeah, I remember the Senate. I was just walking home one day, and you have those benches on the Capitol grounds. It's like there's some kind of canopy, some shelter covering it. It's more near the Senate side than the House side, or at least it's on the Senate side. And I just see a massive, giant dude with just a hoodie and shorts on, and there's Senator Fetterman. So
there he is.
Yeah.
I mean, my one of my decisive memories of him is during that reconciliation battle over the summer. Everybody was in the Senate chamber, and he would take so many breaks. He would just be sitting on one of the benches outside of the Senate chamber and just complaining, when is this going to be over with? We know it's going to be passed. Why do we have to keep bringing up amendments? Let's all just go home and sleep. So
Yeah, and he learned DC much earlier than I think a lot of people might choose to believe, or uh, don't choose to believe, even that they're still thinking it's a different deal than what it actually is. So, but yeah, everybody. Well, just want to again thank our guest, Mr. Nathan Worcester, for coming on the show tonight to speak to you, the Awoken. Glad to have Nathan on. You're welcome back anytime, brother. Thank you very much for your great analysis and complex details and breakdown of the Texas Senate race, and as well other congressional races that I think our viewers will be delighted to learn about.
Well, thank you so much for hosting me, Alden. This was a pleasure, and I'm just glad to be able to talk a little more about something I can tell you I'm working on and thinking about most of the day, every day, weekdays at least, sometimes weekends.
There we go. Yeah, sometimes it's just fun to um, release it in a different kind of alternative method. So,
Exactly, yeah. As opposed to just endlessly scrolling social media and coming up with what's the latest poll number, what's the latest breakdown of that University of Texas poll, where the number of people they polled, was it enough? Was the sample size too small? I mean, you understand if you're a politics junkie just how constant there can be new sources of information out there.
certainly, it's always nitpicking the details. Alrighty, everybody. Well, we're going to sign off tonight. We will. So next Tuesday, just a little programming note. Next Tuesday, we will do the Texas Senate election live. We'll cover that live. This weekend, there's another anti-Iranian regime protest that I'll be doing man on the street interviews with displaced Persians, and maybe do a couple other vertical live streams throughout the weekend or later this week. But thank you very much for watching tonight's stream. We appreciate your attention and hope you learned a great deal about Texas and the midterms that are looming here. March is only a couple days away now. Remember, February is the shortest month of the year, so we're only a couple days away from the third month of this year already.
And I'll just urge you to follow me on social media on X or Twitter. You can find me. I'll be in Texas covering hopefully a few rallies and that final stretch ahead of the actual results coming out of the Secretary of State.
Definitely. And we'll be sure to pin on the comment section, we'll be sure to pin your links and handles and all that so people can find you at an easy rate there.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. All right, everybody, you have been Awoken with Aulden. All right, much love, everybody. Good night. We will see you soon. Thank you very much again to Nathan.